Tech Licensing. Negociando en el mundo de las invenciones. Panelistas: Bennett H. Rockney, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Estados Unidos. Robert Early, Ericsson, Estados Unidos. Moderador: Carlos Olarte Moure, Colombia.
Buenos días. El día de hoy tengo el grato honor, el placer de compartir un panel con dos exponentes en el tema de Tech Licensing, negociando en el mundo de las patentes, unas personas que en su día a día permanentemente están negociando negocios, están generando flujos, ingresos a partir de sus portafolios de patente. Ben, nuestro primer panelista, es un Technology Licensing Officer de MIT, una universidad que no requiere mayor presentación ni en el tema tecnológico ni en el tema de licenciamiento. Tiene la oportunidad de trabajar principalmente con dispositivos médicos y nos va a compartir su experiencia, su día a día en la temática de generar ingresos para MIT, su universidad, sus objetivos, estrategias y su modelo de negocio. Robert Earl es vicepresidente en el tema de Patent Assertion de Ericsson. Como ustedes saben, Ericsson es un jugador mundial, un líder hoy en día en el desarrollo de la tecnología 5G, tecnología que está cobijada por muchísimos jugadores en el mercado, que tienen patentes que cobijan diferentes estándares de tecnología 5G. Nos va a compartir un poquito de background sobre 5G e igualmente cómo el portafolio de patentes de Ericsson es usado para generar ingresos importantes. Un poquito también nos va a compartir cuál es la estrategia. Hay dos temas en general que me gustaría enfocarnos en esta presentación y estamos hablando de dinero, cómo generar flujos de ingreso a través de patentes, es decir, traer el mundo de patentes a la vida real, cómo generamos ingresos a partir de esos inventos. Y acá van a oír de dos personas en compañías, una universidad, otra compañía, sector privado, sector académico. Van a ser modelos relativamente distintos de cómo generar, pero creo que vamos a encontrar algunas coincidencias entre los dos modelos de negocio, igualmente algunas diferencias importantes para poder generar esos ingresos. Sin más, les doy la palabra a Ben para que nos comparta su experiencia con MIT. Muchas gracias.
Well, first, let me thank Asipi for the very gracious invitation and the gracious hospitality you've shown. It's a privilege for me to be here representing MIT. So, as you probably know, really the foundation of academic licensing goes back to the Bayh-Dole Act, which the United States Congress passed in the early 1980s. And under the Bayh-Dole Act, It allows universities who've received funding from the US federal government to own their IP. Prior to that time, the government owned the IP. But along with the privilege of ownership of this federally sponsored work, it's up to the university to license the patent, first of all, to secure patent protection, to license the patent, and to distribute that patent through licensing to typically commercial entities for the benefit of society. And the result has been a cycle of investment really from full circle, from investment by the federal government and commercial entities into the invention process, invention disclosure, patenting, marketing of invention, and licensing. This is shown on this next slide. And this circle is a virtuous circle. It just, at least in the case of MIT and many, many American universities, this circle has grown and grown and grown from investment through invention, through patenting, through marketing, through licensing, through commercialization, and then the successful commercial entities in turn are able to invest back into the university, whether that's MIT or other universities. And in the case of MIT, this is really what differentiates MIT. This is why top faculty, students, postdocs, and research scientists come to MIT. And so our licensing office has been privileged to ride the wave of the Bayh-Dole Act. We have about 50 people in our office, 10 licensing officers, of whom I am one. Each officer, about half on the physical sciences, half on the life sciences. Each officer is responsible for a particular area of licensing. And the result of this slide shows the MIT campus. MIT buildings are in red, right around the Charles River, this large river in blue. And around it are many companies, large companies, pharmaceutical companies, Google, Apple, telecommunications companies, VCs, and dozens of startups that have grown around this circle with MIT at its center. And across the river, not mentioned, are a whole lot of very, very famous, world-famous hospitals, most affiliated with Harvard. But it really is the presence of MIT that has just invigorated this portion of Cambridge. So I'll give you just a few facts about our office, and then we'll talk about what a licensing deal from MIT to industry typically looks like, and then I look forward to taking some questions during the discussion period. Our office receives about 800 new disclosures a year. Each of the licensing officers at MIT handles typically on the order of about 500 cases. I actually have 700 in my portfolio of medical devices. We have 7,000 active cases. These are cases with active IP. We file about 450 patents a year, so roughly half of the invention disclosures that we receive, we file on. This results in 300 patents issued per year. And this does not include all of the foreign or, it does include continuations and divisionals, but doesn't include all of the foreign jurisdictions. We write about 100 licenses a year. About 25% of those are to startups, and these are typically coming out of the MIT community, postdocs or research scientists who want to start a company. And in our database, we have 1,200 active licenses. So it's a very, very busy office with a lot of activity. And I always say that I'm very, very privileged to be on the receiving end of all of these really bright ideas coming out of the MIT labs, all the bright inventions, privileged to make decisions about which ones to patent, and then privileged to help so many startups build their business, understand what a licensing deal from MIT might look like, and craft one that meets their sort of individual needs. And a truly remarkable statistic is the impact that MIT has had on the Massachusetts and the US economy. If you look at all of the companies that have an MIT connection, MIT alumni who started the company, licenses from MIT, inventions from MIT, we're responsible for annual revenues, it's really kind of hard to believe, about $2 trillion. And so that group of companies that have come out of the MIT connection are something like the 10th largest country, equivalent to something like the 10th largest country in the world by gross domestic product. So really, obviously MIT was a wonderful, vibrant school for 100 years. Obviously, really wonderful people have come, but it is really the sort of the entrepreneurial emphasis of MIT which has resulted in this continuing circle of sort of increasing entrepreneurship, and again, that's why people come. Back in the 1980s, I worked for a corporation called Polaroid. You may all know it, though the name Polaroid is quickly disappearing from common use. And I worked just up the street from my current office in the mid-1980s. And all of my colleagues, we hated to work in Cambridge. It was chain link fences, it was trash blowing down the street, it was abandoned warehouses. MIT was still there, MIT was vibrant. But it's really been in the last 20 or 30 years, since the mid-'80s, that Cambridge has grown. And I hope you have a chance to visit. It's just a remarkable place with modern high-rise buildings housing all of these different companies that have begun. So that's just a brief introduction to our office. Let me just speak a little bit about licensing. This is really true of all universities, at least in the United States. What we're looking for in a license, we want to protect the mission of the university, and this always sounds a little bit dishonest. It really isn't, at least at MIT, it really isn't completely about the money. We always say that the impact of an invention is more important than the revenue that the invention brings to MIT. So MIT's primary mission is to disseminate these wonderful inventions out to the world so that they can be commercialized and used. MIT does no product development. We have no companies. Our mechanism of getting our inventions out to the world is through licensing. It's also important that MIT protects its endowment. And so in our licensing deals, we require our licensees to carry insurance, to indemnify MIT against damages. And MIT doesn't make representations or warranties on the eventual validity of the patent or its usefulness. And I should mention that we very frequently license patents everywhere from provisional applications up through patent families with many granted patents and the like. So really there's a whole continuation of when we license. Typically a startup would be more at the provisional or first filing end of a utility application. And then it's also important that MIT protects its name. As I said, we do not develop products, and it's important that we not be viewed as endorsing the products and the inventions that come out. It's important for us to maintain our integrity as an academic institution. We will allow our licensees to issue a press release saying they have a license from MIT, but we're very careful about the use of the MIT logo. Having said all that, of course, we do want to be rewarded fairly for the work that MIT has done in building its reputation over more than a century. And so we do want to be rewarded fairly when our licensees achieve success because of our inventions. So let's talk a little bit of specifics about a license. And the slide is titled for a startup license. It's not that much different if we were licensing Pfizer, though the numbers tend to be larger. But typically a license to MIT technology will grant exclusive rights, sometimes in all fields, but generally we try to divide the fields up so that we have our eggs in different baskets. I hope that idiom translates well. And for every field that we license, we will put in what we call diligence obligations. We don't allow a patent troll to license our IP. We want to make sure that our licensees are sincerely working to bring their licensed technology to market. And so we'll put in diligence obligations on how much research and development dollars they put in, what milestones they have to meet in development along the way, perhaps when they introduce a product or when they file for regulatory approval from the Food and Drug Administration, or obligations on net sales by year. We want to make it so that they have to work hard to keep the license, and if they completely fail, if they completely stumble, well, we will usually amend the license, but at some point we want to be able to take that license back so that we can give it to somebody else. Upfront fees for a startup might be in the $5,000 to $20,000 range. For a larger company, maybe 50,000. If it's a very, very hot therapeutic and it's a biotech company, the upfront fee might be 100 or 200,000. But really more like 5 to 50,000, 5 to even 20,000 is more typical. In a startup, we would typically ask for some equity in the company, and we ask for anti-dilution, typically again through the achievement of Series A funding by the startup. And this is in exchange for higher upfront fees. We try to keep our upfront fees to a startup low. And in general, with an exclusive license, we ask for reimbursement of past patent expenses and reimbursement of ongoing expenses. And we will work with our licensee. MIT continues to lead the patent prosecution, but we'll work with our licensee to craft the patent family as it develops to make sure that their interests as well as those of the university are being met. And then we do have ongoing fees, which would be a percentage of a royalty percentage of the net sales that our licensee or our sub-licensee gets. In the medical device field, 5% would be typical. 2 to 7, in broader fields, more widespread fields would be common. We do ask for a minimum annual royalty. We call it a maintenance fee, but that maintenance fee can be offset with a royalty. So in effect, it's a minimum annual royalty. And frequently, our licensees will sub-license the technology. Perhaps they'll sub-license it in a different field that they're not going to be active in. Perhaps they're a small company and their business model is to develop partnerships, strategic partnerships with large corporations. And so we ask to share in some fraction of that sublicense income. And then finally, particularly in the life sciences where there's major inflection points in the value of a startup, we'll put milestone payments in at these inflection points, like a first in-human clinical trial or FDA approval. Sometimes also, and this would not necessarily be in the life sciences, but in any field, we'll ask for some milestone payments when they achieve some great success in sales. The most successful license in MIT's history, and this is very untypical, no one should assume that this is a typical license. The most successful license in MIT's history was in the field of high-definition television. Some of the very early standards on HDTV were invented at MIT, and MIT has successfully licensed on a non-exclusive basis to just about every major television manufacturer in the world. And at its peak in one particular year, and honestly, I don't know why that one year, 2012, is so high. It might have been some sort of major milestone. In one year, we achieved almost $100 million in licensing revenue. Unfortunately, those patents have all expired in the last year, so that number dropped from sort of in the 100 to 50 million range right down to zero. But fortunately, our office does still have enough other license income to come in to cover our expenses. But one thing that's interesting about this slide, and it is very typical of the licensing history of IP, is that it was really many years, about 15 years from the beginning of the invention until significant royalties came into MIT. Now, again, in this case, those significant royalties were in the 30 million range. More typically, a significant royalty on a really good license might be more in the $1 or $2 or $3 million range. But the lesson does hold. It takes a long time. The inventions coming out of a university are very early, and it does take a long time for these inventions to reach the market. Just a couple of success stories, and then I'll turn it over to Robert in a moment. Just a couple success stories coming out of our licensing office. These are more on the life sciences side than the physical sciences, but we've founded a couple of successful pharmaceutical startups, Momenta and Alnylam in RNA therapy. In the world of surgical devices, there's a company called OmniGuide, which is developing very high-powered CO2 lasers delivered by optical fiber in an endoscope. And they're up and running and doing well. And then this picture of a prosthetic ankle was developed by a professor at MIT by the name of Hugh Hare, who lost both his legs in a mountaineering accident as a teenager and has devoted his life since to developing these very modern, sophisticated ankle and foot prosthetics driven by multiple microprocessors and a lithium-ion battery driving pistons. And he's now starting to integrate these legs with nerve signals coming from the body, initially just with sensors on the outside that detect the user's wish to flex his leg, but not too far down the road, probably optogenetic technology will be applied, and one can use light to pick up or to pick up requests, neural requests from the brain to the leg, or to deliver feedback from the ankle back into the leg, or back into the human body. Initially, he founded a company called iWalk, which turned into a company called Bionics. And then Bionics recently was bought by Ottobock, which is a large German prosthetic company, the leading company for prosthetics in the world. And then this is a licensee that's close to my heart. This is a license that I wrote, a company called Squeeze Biotech that has developed a very, very interesting technology for injecting DNA into cells, for transfection, for cell therapies. And the principle is to run the cells through a microfluidic channel that squeezes the cells. It disrupts the cellular membrane for a short period of time, allowing DNA or RNA to pass through the cell membrane and into the cell. And then at that point, the cell has new DNA and it makes new proteins. And probably you're familiar with some of the new cell-based therapies in immuno-oncology. This is an interesting case. This company originally licensed the IP thinking that they would manufacture these devices, that they would sell these devices to researchers and other therapeutic companies. But a few years into the license, they quickly realized that there's not much money in making these devices, and now they have partnered with Roche is public. They certainly have some other partnerships that they're working on that have really massive milestone payments downstream, where Roche is interested in developing drugs, working with Squeeze to get the DNA that's needed to produce these drugs into cells, and then bring these drugs through the FDA. So Squeeze has taken a very interesting model of partnering with large pharmaceutical companies and moving into the therapeutic space rather than just the device space. Just for reference, this is one of the larger licensees in the portfolio that I've written, and it's bringing in a couple of $1 million a year. Again, that's a very good license. That's not typical. So with that, I thank you, and I'll turn the podium over to Robert, and I hope you'll see some contrast, some similarities and contrasts between academic licensing and what Robert will speak of. Thank you.
I tell you what, we're going to start this with a very, very short quiz. Raise your hand if you believe that Ericsson makes telephones. I'm impressed. Most of the time when you use the name Ericsson, people remember the Sony Ericsson merger that we had where we were making telephones. And I think they were actually pretty good telephones, but that business has stopped several years ago. So what does Ericsson do now? We provide infrastructure. We provide the equipment that your cell signals travel through from various, no matter what country you're in, and we're one of the top 3, and we can argue which is 1, 2, or 3, but we're in the top 3 across the world for providing infrastructure equipment, cell towers, base stations, et cetera, so that when your phone reaches out to the tower, that's a lot of times our equipment that it's running through. So I'm going to give you a little bit different perspective today about why do you want to license your patents? Or as Carlos said, why the money? What's important? What does it do for you? And why do you need to close that part of the loop out? Again, the thing that our theme is going to be is promoting sustainable innovation. And you know, you have a lot of great minds at MIT. We feel like we have a lot of great minds working with us at Ericsson. In the end, we're trying to solve problems, right? So let's look at Ericsson a little bit of a glance. We believe that patents are an important part of Ericsson technology develop year in, year out. And why does that happen? Why do you have to have that? It's this cycle, a little bit different than the circle you saw a few minutes ago when Ben was talking, but our belief is that the revenue generated from the inventions and the licensing of those inventions is fed back into R&D, which again makes more inventions. As you can see, the cycle continues to go to ensure that you're able to continue to develop new technologies. In this case, for us, particularly in the telecommunication sector. So a little bit more about Ericsson at a glance. As I mentioned to you before, networks, digital services, managed services, technology and emerging businesses. Who are we? Ericsson was founded in 1876, and we're globally around the world, 180 plus countries. We're currently at about 95,000 employees. But these next two numbers, I think, take a little bit more emphasis. We have roughly almost 25,000 employees dedicated to research and development. So you can do the math. Of 95,000 overall employees, 25,000 of them are innovating, are trying to solve problems in technology space. And what's that generate? Our portfolio size currently is right around 49,000 patents worldwide. And as a lot of you that deal with patents know, a patent portfolio is kind of a living entity. Patents die, patents come in. But that's generally where we sit as far as the overall account. So why is this important for us? Well, there's a couple things that are very obvious to most of you. We want to protect the rights of the inventorship, sure. Licensing revenue that's there to enable further investment in R&D, yes. And the R&D investment drives innovation. Maybe it's good now just for a moment to understand, from Ericsson's perspective, how does the innovation work? Where does Ericsson come into play in your day-to-day life and your telephone and how you use it? Some of you may be checking messages now. That cellular signal is going out. What happens? Ericsson is very, very involved in standard-setting organization, in this case, ETSI. It's a European Telecommunication Standards Institute. That group comes together through various groups. Some of you may have heard of 3GPP specifically, that it tries to solve problems that come up on a daily basis with regards to how you use your phone and how your phone interconnects from various networks, various towers as you travel the world. What happens in these meetings are people come in with problems. It may be a room not quite this big, but with many people inside, and they begin to debate and figure out how to solve the problem. Maybe the problem is that you're, something as simple as you're dropping a signal because two are hitting this at the same microsecond, or whatever the situation you may have. And engineers begin to discuss, can we do this? Can we do that? Maybe this. That time of debate, consensus-driven, a result is chosen. That result then goes into the standard, all right? There's a trade-off there, though, right? Because if you require that technology to be used everywhere across the world, how do you protect the rest of the communications or telecom space from you having an undue influence or overly large ability to use that? In fact, you have to have the technology, so therefore, I'm going to take advantage of someone. That's where some of you may have heard over time, you come into the term FRAND. Fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And that's the contract that innovators like Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, others have with ETSI. And the fact is, if you adopt our technology into the standard, we in return will agree to license that technology to people using it at a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory basis. And there's often a lot of debate about what those different words mean. And as you know, most of your attorneys, anytime you use the word reasonable, it's job security, right? So we understand what is and what is not valid. But it's a very good check and balance against the system so that you still encourage the innovators to continue to contribute technology to the standard, but at the same time, you make the technology available. I'm going to ask you this is our second quiz question for the night. How much does it cost to download the standard if you download it right now? If you think it's less than $1, raise your hand. Less than $1,000, raise your hand. You know what? Right now, if you had a laptop computer, you can download the current standard for 4G as I'm speaking to you right now. You don't have to pay a fee. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to agree to let them send you junk email for the rest of your life. You can get it right now. Then becomes the interesting part of this whole process, though, is, well, if I can download it with no cost, then why do I want to pay for it, right? And I'm going to jump a little bit ahead on one of the slides, but there's a theory called, you often hear when people talk about license holders, they refer to that as hold up, right? Maybe you've heard the term before. What hold up meaning? Well, look, my technology in the standard, I'm going to exert an unusually high price because I've got you over a barrel, right? You've got to use it. If your phone's going to work country to country, you've got to use our technology. And that's where the FRAND commitment comes in, that contract between Ericsson, for example, and Etsy to balance that, to be sure that we don't do that as innovators and to continue to put technology into the standard, into how your phones work. There's a countervailing doctrine called hold out. Now, what's hold out mean? Well, hold out is a situation where if I can download the technology, let's say I'm a startup phone company, I don't have any R&D, I don't really have a whole lot of experience doing phones, but I've got a fairly low-cost phone coming out. I want to be able to get up to speed and get in the market very quickly. I download the standard, the technology, get it into my phone, and I go out and sell it. Wow, that's a good deal, right? I mean, why? I can get it. My profit margin's higher. I can sell phones quicker. I can do a better job getting in the market quicker because my overhead cost is less. Why? Because at this point in time, I'm not paying a license fee. Others are. So it gives you, by its very nature, competitive advantage over the other people you're competing against. What do you do to counter that? And it's kind of, maybe I'll put it into a better analogy. Imagine you go down to a retail electronics store, and you look in there and you say, yeah, I like that TV right there. That's a nice TV, 4K, not as nice as this screen, but nice, right? And I'm gonna go pick up the box, and I'm gonna walk past the person at the cash register. I got this, I'm okay. And you keep walking. And the guy goes, but no, it's good. I'm okay. I'll talk to you later. It's all good. And you walk out the door with the television. Well, now the guy back at the TV store is like, well, wait a second. You didn't pay for the TV. I'm just trying it out for a while. I'll let you know how it works out. I'll get back to you shortly. Well, maybe a month, 2 months, 3 months, year, 4 years, 5 years go by, and now the TV stores realize, hey, it's not going so well. They're using the TV, they're watching TV, but I'm not getting any revenue for it. That's where here the licensing part of it comes into play. That's where the revenue comes back in for that. But it's very unusual what you hear sometimes when you ask for that. When you go back in and say, excuse me, sir, you took the TV out of the store a while back. I need you to go ahead and pay for it since you had the TV. Well, I saw your price you had on there, but that's not a good price anymore. Well, why is that? Well, it's an old TV now. I've been watching it for 6 months. Yeah, but when you took it off the shelf, it was new. Yeah, but let's debate and discuss this more and more until we can figure out a good price. And what you'll notice happening here is it's all incentive for the person having technology to delay that process as long as possible. Why? The economics, right? You don't have to pay. We had a profit margin, and I can use it for free. What I won't pay for it. That's the point when it puts the burden back on us in Ericsson's licensing program to go back in, and in my little story about the guy at the electronics store, I'm the guy in the electronics store who goes, hey, where's the money? We need to put money back in that cycle, right? Remember the circle? To go back in and to get more revenue going to R&D, more to fund the purposes, to solve more questions, get more technology back in. Now, in a perfect world, our desire is always this. We want to get a license done. Now, Ericsson does this licenses on a global basis. With 49,000 patents in countries all over the world, it's almost impractical. I mean, it's impossible. We can start litigating today, and I think my great-great-grandchild maybe could finish the last patent up, assuming the patents don't expire, which we all know they do, to do that. So we go back at this process in as a global patent license agreement. Now, initially, the process is a little bit interesting to note, and I'm kind of going off script on the slide, so I apologize for that. But what happens is we'll approach a company that's using technology that doesn't have a license. And we'll say, look, You're using it. We'd like to get you licensed, and then you begin the negotiations. Now, what's unique about our position is that we have over 100 licenses with major players. Some of the companies you may have heard of: Apple, Samsung, Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo. Some of the top Samsung, the top makers, telecom providers, handset providers in the world, right? And you would say, well, how do you establish what a fair price is? Well, and that's been a lot of debate about that, and there are a lot of court cases around the world trying to establish, in essence, what is FRAND and what rates are too high or not too high. In our case, we use what we call a comparative license agreement model. And what I mean by that is we will take our prior license agreements and we will unpack them. And unpack them means that, basically distill it down. It's oftentimes 30 pages, 40 pages, and break it down to the meat. How much? How much per phone is this company paying and that company paying? And when we look at those licenses, they provide a range of numbers. And at our perspective, that's what we view as what the FRAND rate is for our portfolio. Remember, it's changing. So that when we license someone over, say, a 5-year period, everything that comes in, they get. If some things go out, that happens too. In the end, it stays about the same, right? Now, we're on the verge now of going into 5G, so that's a little bit different because of the advancement over to the next generation technology. But once we have that rate, we go to the implementer or the person using the technology and say, okay, here's what we'd like you to pay. And I wish that was all it took. But it doesn't. So when these negotiations break down over time, I get a call. And I'm asked to activate the team that works on the patent assertion and enforcement and go, look, hey, we got some problems here. We're talking to a potential licensor that doesn't want to pay. What do we do about that? My team comes in to work to basically provide incentive to get the person to go to the table in good faith to resolve the cost of the technology it's using, okay? And that oftentimes can take anywhere from years of negotiations and often years of litigation. And sometimes, we get people to agree up front. I'm going to go ahead and go through the rest of these slides pretty quickly so I won't miss any points. But you can see there, part of our strategy is our global patent development strategy. We are in many, many countries, in several countries in South America. I highlighted Brazil here because we have existing enforcement actions in Brazil, and we've used that venue several times for patent enforcement. But you also see India is another market that's an emerging market with large numbers that we've been involved in there as well. As I've mentioned to you before, remember that idea I talked about that when someone's sitting there and they solve the problem with Etsy? At the same time that idea goes in the standard, we file a patent on it. Those patents are called standard essential patents, right? But we also have what we would call implementation patents, which are more patents that aren't necessarily involved in the standard, but do impact or touch on the telecom space. All right, and you can see here, again, some of the things I've already highlighted with how the standards and the larger portfolios work around. And I anticipate we may have some questions about 5G, which I'll be happy to try to answer for you during the question period. Okay, and we talked about holdout a few minutes ago. And again, that's a big debate that's happening on the legal market worldwide right now. And the bottom line here, right, is everybody needs to play nice. And what I mean by that is, look, if you're going to use this stuff, pay for it. And if we're going to license it, we got to be fair, too, about it as well. And when I went back a few minutes ago speaking to you about the comparable license agreement, look, sometimes we hear arguments, well, you're a bully. No, I don't think so. We've got Apple to agree to this. They don't get bullied by anybody, right? We've got Samsung to agree to this. They don't bully very well either. Well, but they don't really understand. Yeah, I think they do. Yeah, I can tell you, I litigated against Apple. At one point, we wound up giving you an idea of scope. We asserted 56 patents simultaneous in 10 different jurisdictions. Of those jurisdictions, 4 different countries at the same time. We were able to get a deal worked out with Apple within 12 months of the initial suits being filed. So there is a place in here for litigation, because oftentimes you're going to be pushed and you're going to be tested to be able to come back in and to figure out, what is right. In the end, I'm going to leave you with a very simple thought. We need to have innovators from MIT, we need to have innovators from Ericsson and from other places in the world to be able to solve the world's problems, to advance technology in a way every day that we get better. That's only going to happen if you can have a strong and effective IP protection system in place. Without that, the incentive for innovation goes way down. Inventions begin to get in-house as trade secrets, and the public doesn't get the advantage of being able to use this stuff on a daily basis for many of the things that we often now take for granted. So with that, I will give Carlos back 2 minutes for some additional questions, and thank you very much.
Ben and Robert, thank you very much. Some great presentations. I learned a lot. Thank you. As moderator, I'd like to take advantage of this position. I'll start you off with some questions. Going back to Ben, I found something. I was trying to figure something out in the projects where you're working on with industry. And I was wondering, and this is a question that often comes up with universities regarding whether this is good or bad, which is, should I start projects off with industry from the very beginning? Is that what I should be looking for? Because those sorts of projects typically end up with something quite usable from the get-go. Or do I privilege the basic science projects? I just start throwing out stuff out there. And I was thinking, MIT probably has a good mix of both. Do you, as the technology transfer office, prefer one or the other? Do you privilege one or the other? Do you get pressure from faculty, from the endowment to privilege one or the other with those projects?
Is this on? There we go. So by new projects, you mean new activities around a professor at MIT who's going to be working in a particular area.
Exactly.
So the short answer to your question of do we get pressure, no, we really don't. MIT pursues basic science and basic engineering for its own ends. We historically have received most of our R&D funding from the federal government and occasionally non-US governments as well, for example, Kuwait, the government in Madrid. But historically, most of our research funding has come from one government organization or another. In the United States, that funding is drying up, and so as a university, we're under some pressure to shift some of that research and development funding sources to industry. Historically, most of our licenses have come out of basic research rather than out of the industrially funded research. When a company like Ericsson comes to MIT and wants to sponsor work in the lab of a professor, we give them certain rights that expire after a period of time to new IP that is invented. And so typically an industrial sponsor will have a right for some period of time to take a royalty-bearing exclusive license in that new IP or to take a royalty-free non-exclusive license. Those are MIT's typical terms, and those are common, I think, among US universities. I don't know if I should say this, but it's fairly rare for new IP to come out of that industrially sponsored work that ends up being licensed. I say I don't know if I should say it because probably if all the companies knew this, they wouldn't sponsor more work with us. But there are some exceptions to that that are very, very lucrative. But in general, most of our licenses are written around IP that has been federally funded.
Thank you for that. And Robert, I was also turning to you and the presentation. I was thinking about the litigation surrounding the new 5G stuff, and I assume most folks here reading the news know there are other companies, obviously, that are saying they have 5G and they have lots of patents in this space. When when you're asserting patents, I would assume you probably get pushback from like a Samsung or a Huawei saying, I also have patents in the space. Let's do a little mix and match, a little pushback there. How's that work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's when you deal with someone that has a patent portfolio, first of all, Ericsson always requires a cross-license when we do a global patent license agreement. Even if you don't have patents, you may get some during the course of that period, so you need to have protection for that. As I mentioned to you before, Ericsson has infrastructure. The infrastructure we're approached daily about trying to get licensing revenues from us. So basically, we're a company, we're a licensor and a licensee. Now, when you have two competing portfolios like that, we do something that's kind of unusual but specific for the telecom space is that the two parties will sit together at a big table with a bunch of engineers on both sides, and you'll evaluate each other's portfolio. And those are called technical discussions, and they often can go on for as long as a week. Oftentimes, for example, we may send over 150, 200 claim charts to a prospective licensee. If you got questions, let us know. They'll sort through and pull some out, and they want to ask about them, and we'll sit back and go back and forth. Based upon those discussions, the parties will come up with what's called a patent strength ratio. In essence, how strong is my patent versus company A's patents? That ratio will help decide the cross-license value that's attributed. For example, let's say that this is the amount is what you would owe if you didn't have any patents. Then after the patents, you get basically a discount for that ratio to be sure that you're fair there, but it also accounts for the licensing going both directions.
Okay. Sounds like a lot of work for patent lawyers. Thanks. I'd love to open up the field for questions here. We've got a good amount of time for questions, so I think we have some microphones floating around, and I'll start off. Roberto, is that you back there?
Good morning. Thank you for the speaker for taking the time here, being here with us. My name is Roberto from Puerto Rico. I have a question, maybe more of a what are your thoughts about starting licensing or commercialization of technology in terms of provisional application versus patented technology. I mean, I'm assuming probably provisional applications are more advantageous for the university. Sometimes you use it as a tool against a quick publication that probably one of your researchers just told you yesterday. That happens. Maybe I would love to see, what are your thoughts in terms of Ericsson? I mean, I would think that most of your filings are just straight non-provisionals. I mean, I don't see a scenario where filing a provisional will be beneficial. But would you recommend, which is my question, or at what stage would you recommend starting licensing technology? I mean, is it possible to do it at a provisional, when you file a provisional, while it's patent pending, or you usually wait until it's patented, in terms of your foreign IP filings? Thank you.
So I think there were several questions in there. I think one was the value of a provisional filing, and another question was, at what point do we license IP? Does that pretty much summarize it? So our office files a lot of provisional patent applications, and it's something we really don't like to do, and we really are trying to continuously train our professors and postdocs to give us ample time to file a good utility grade or good utility application. The reality is patenting is not typically on the minds of our professors. I should have said back in that Bayh-Dole discussion that the Bayh-Dole requirement requires us to share licensing revenue with our professors. For many of them, that's the really only motivation they have to think about patents, is the hope that someday their patents will be licensed and they'll get some revenue. But having said that, it's really not in their day-to-day thinking. They're really much more focused on publications. And so very, very frequently, we will get an email over the weekend saying, I forgot to tell you, but I'm presenting a paper on Monday morning. And we have really no opportunity, really nothing else we can do other than to file a cover sheet provisional patent application. As our office has learned and become more sophisticated through the years, we've learned that provisional patent applications cover sheet are often of very little value and in fact can really hurt you, particularly in eventually entering Europe. So we really try to avoid cover sheet applications. When we file a provisional, we will typically ask our attorney to put their focus into writing good claims and making sure that there's literal support for those claims in the specification. So we do it a lot, but it's because we are sort of dragged into it by publication deadlines. Now, having said that, we license a lot of applications that are just in the provisional stage. And how do licensees hear about that? It's because right after that provisional patent is filed, the publication takes place, the conference takes place, people in the audience hear about it, they ask the professor what can they do to investigate licensing, and the professor will give them the names of our office. So we license many, many provisional applications. We'll always, of course, convert them to utility filings.
We have some of this very similar views on provisional applications. Sometimes you can't help it and you have to do it, but I think in the end, if everything being in an ideal, optimal world, you would not have to use those. As far as your question about going out with, what do we do with a patent pending, that kind of scenario, we will not take a pending patent into a licensing negotiations. Now, if a person picks up a license during that time period and that patent does issue, it comes in, they get that. But we're going to go into the discussions with full-out patents, many times multiple jurisdictional patents, so they can understand the full coverage of the technology that we're having. And we think it's actually probably, from our perspective, a lot more compelling argument to come back in. And you take away some of this speculation about, well, maybe it won't issue, or maybe the standard's going to deviate. When you have that straight mapping coming out, it's hard to, with a straight face, to say, no, I don't do that.
That's a very, very interesting contrast between academic and commercial licensing. Our license agreements typically will expire, the term when the last patent expires or when the patents are all abandoned. So we certainly allow our licensees to get out of the license with no penalty, really at any time, but specifically there are times when a patent application is just reaching the bitter end and all parties agree it's not worth pursuing and the license ends. But we definitely do license a lot of pending applications.
Thank you for that question, Roberto. I think we had one up here. Up in front. There we go. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much in the first place. It was very enlightening, and the numbers are really impressive. Now, as you may know, in Latin America, resident people do not really patent, but they use other strategies to commercialize their IP. Patents are rather expensive to file, and I wonder if you have any specific advice concerning patents registered by Latin Americans that are intended to become global because of the expenses. Are there any possible alliances that people interested in developing these patents abroad can do? And another related question is, how do you develop your deal flow, specifically at MIT? Because that's another point that Latin American universities usually face. They have very interesting projects, but they cannot translate those projects into viable business opportunities. So what's the secret sauce, as it were?
So I think the question is, given the expense of patent filing, what can Latin American universities do to kind of leverage the money they have to spend? And how can they perhaps collaborate with universities like MIT? Is that the question? Okay, I'm getting a nod. So really the best way so MIT, we don't typically, I notice I've said the word typically a lot in my talk. At MIT, we say never. With the number of licenses and patents we filed, there's an exception to everything. But we don't typically take on patents from third parties and combine them with our portfolios and license them. The route into MIT is through a joint invention. So our professors collaborate with institutions all over the world, and so really the best way to kind of work off the back of MIT or other US universities is to establish a collaboration, and it's really relationships, right? It's one professor meeting another at a conference and getting to know one another and getting to know the work, and then agreeing to collaborate. We have a tremendous number of joint inventions. In my portfolio with medical devices, MIT doesn't have a hospital. We have no medical school. So probably at least half of my cases are joint with another institution, many from South America. And I think we understand that the size of the office in Cambridge at MIT is different than the size of the office in some of our South American partners. And honestly, we are willing to take on much more of the cost of pursuing patents if they are valuable. We're really pretty generous that way. So I don't know to the extent that this is helpful. This is probably not a huge, wide open pathway, but really I think the best way to collaborate with MIT is through the relationship of an investigator to investigator. And then when a joint invention happens, we get on the phone or through email with our corresponding partner office, whether they're in Europe or the United States or Latin America, South America, and we write up a joint invention agreement and agree on that. But we're pretty understanding and I think pretty good to work with.
Maybe just one thing to add to that, and maybe from the commercial perspective, is that I think what you touched on is the million-dollar question, right? Where do you put your money in the most effective way? And whether or not it's through collaboration or because you're taking resources you have to do that, it's hard, right? Because of the patent cycle coming through, you basically have to predict now what's going to happen ideally 5 years from now. Where the product is going to be that you need to license? Where's the technology going in that direction? What makes the most sense to move the money here or there? I often equate, to compare the patent development process to assertion and enforcement. Patent development's like a super tanker. It moves very slowly, and you can start turning it, and it's just going to eventually come around. Whereas, I think assertion's maybe like a cigarette boat. You go fast, and you move, and you jump around, and what's happening next? We struggle with that too. I think it's difficult to do. We have a very active pruning program, so that if we have filed the first filings and we see that the technology went away from that, then cut your loss. Or we see this the opposite, where technology is beginning to grab hold, its significance is increasing, then we double down. And we may at that point push the filings out to a larger geographical span across the world for obvious reasons. So, but you hit it right on the head. It's a hard thing to do without being clairvoyant at times.
Thank you, guys. Do you have another question? Let's see, because I got one. While folks maybe come up with something else, Ben, as far as patent assertion, this has been more of a patent licensing, patent assertion conversation. For MIT, I assume it's not a lot, and we did talk about it internally. How does MIT view patent assertion? When is the right time? When, probably you don't like to look like the plaintiff constantly, but I assume at some moment in time it does become necessary to get paid for, agreements to actually be followed through. How do you do it? How do you make that decision?
Yeah, there are several answers to that question. So MIT does occasionally assert a patent. We do occasionally take an infringer, bring suit against an infringer or an alleged infringer. It's a very difficult decision for MIT. It takes a lot of discussion. It's actually not done in my office. It's done above us in the Office of General Counsel. Some of the competing things that MIT considers are that, on the one hand, we don't want to be viewed as a patent troll or a non-practicing entity. Technically, on paper, MIT is a non-practicing entity. As I said in my talk, we don't develop products. And so we're very, very concerned about the image of MIT bringing suit against an infringer, particularly a smaller infringer. So that leads us towards being very hesitant to assert our patents against infringers. On the other hand, we have 1,000 licensees who are counting on us to defend our IP. They've paid us money and they're continuing to pay us money for exclusive rights to that patent, and that patent is an important competitive edge for them. And so we also don't want to be seen to be turning over and playing dead when we see an obvious case of infringement. So those are the two tensions we face. A third tension is the reality that when we bring a suit against a large company for infringement, their first defense is not typically to say they don't infringe. Their first defense is to attack the patent itself, and to typically on either patentable subject matter, ALICE, or on obviousness. MIT brought a major suit against Apple and Micron recently for alleged infringement of dynamic RAM technology, and the result of that was that Apple and Micron won and MIT lost its patents. So there's a lot of things to consider. We are, at any given moment, typically pursuing one or two infringers. I have one in my portfolio that I plan to assert against, but I'm waiting till a little bit more opportune time. So, did I get all the questions? It seemed to me there was another question in there that I didn't answer.
I think you definitely nailed it. I don't know if you wanted to.
Okay.
I know you have some particular concerns regarding invalidity in the U.S., but I don't know if you want to share that. But I know a lot of folks that I was speaking to in the audience did just have the general concern, going back to 5G. How do you see Ericsson playing out in the overall field, your patent strength, and things moving forward? I know there's a lot of what you refer to as clairvoyance, imagining what the future is going to be like. But how do you see it playing out as far as leadership, especially regarding Samsung, Huawei, and obviously I think a lot of folks are also thinking the security issues with China. How does that play into this whole thing?
Yes, I think that's a very good question and a very complex one to answer. I think, first of all, looking at 5G as a whole, we do feel like Ericsson is a leader, and there's different ways you measure as far as who's leading in what. And I'm gonna tell you, it's in a very, very hard, aggressive being pushed by Huawei right now to gain a leadership position through there. Now you can look at some different ways to do it. Some people say, well, you count the number of contributions you make to the standard. That's one way. Another way is you look at the number of patents that are declared. That's another way. I would probably lean in those two choices, probably go more with the contributions over the number of declared patents, because it's easier to over-declare, right? The ETSI contract requires anything that may be standard essential, you have to go ahead and report it back in. But I think what's probably a little bit more telling as far as the evolution of 5G and where we came, and I kind of ran through it quickly and didn't touch on it much during the presentation earlier, but two things about 5G that Ericsson did this time for the first time in a generational change. First of all, before the 5G standard was set, it came out, basically when they said, this is how we're going to do it, Ericsson raised his hand and said, look, we've been developing this technology for years. This is what we're going to charge for it, even before we take the first bit of our technology into the standard. You know up front, it's our ex-ante price. It's going to be from this. This is a range. If you don't want to pay that, I think that's too high, use someone else's solution first. And that was received very well, I think, worldwide. And by the way, we do have a technology still in 5G. The other aspect we have is we have probably, I think the record right now is the world's largest patent with over, I think it's 170 inventors, and it's crazy. But it's the foundational patent for 5G. And what I mean by that, it sets out the technology. What is the core platform? And if you think about a house, right, it's your foundation. What are we going to build 5G from there? And I think it tells a really interesting story about how all these different, this piece of technology and this piece all kind of come together for an overall composite. And I think that's interesting. And I think the last point you asked is, what's going to be the big advantage for 5G, right, besides having a 5 and being used from marketing perspective? And I think we were talking about this before we came out for the panel, and I think the easiest way to answer that is latency. And what I mean by that is that the time that everything reacts is going to be so much faster. And I use an example we used in the labs at Ericsson, where we had a robot. that was sitting there, very simply trained to catch a ball. The ball would drop, the robot would catch the ball as it came down. When you fed the robot commands with over 4G network, it always missed. It would close its hands and the ball would go through. You instruct the robot with 5G, it caught it. Now, where's that impact us? Automobiles, self-driving, remote surgery, other areas like this. But you're going to see a lot more of the technology being away from the devices, back in the cloud, for example, where you can have a cheaper device, longer battery life, and I think be able to do more with it than we could in previous generations.
Thank you. Some time went by. I don't know if we have any more questions. Doesn't look like it. I got one more regarding, there's a lot of colleagues here in the antitrust field as well. FRAND litigation, quite popular among antitrust authorities now in the US and Europe. And naturally, whenever you start talking about that, it always invites the authorities' attention. How has Ericsson been dealing with that and with that sort of litigation?
I think a lot of times you'll see antitrust litigation brought. It's a fairly inexpensive way to challenge the licensors trying to come back in. It's very low cost for the licensee. I think maybe the best guidance you can see is some recent Department of Justice discussions about this in the US, when they've came back and said that in reality, if you have a breach of FRAND, it's not an antitrust issue, it's a breach of contract. Because the way that it would work is Ericsson has a contract with Etsy. The people that use the technology are third-party beneficiaries of that contract. So they still have the ability to make sure Ericsson complies with this deal with Etsy. That's where the fight really should be, right? It's a breach of contract action. I think it's, by its very nature, patent law pushes against antitrust, but that's what patents are. They're monopolies, right? So how do you balance those with the antitrust implications? But I do think that the movement in the DOJ in the US right now is a pretty productive step forward in that respect.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think our time is up. I just want to close. Thanking you very much for your participation, and thank the audience for their attention and bringing us to this moment. Thank you very much. Have a great conference.
Thank you.